Well, in Sudan, there's what the world has tagged the betrayal of peaceful revolution going on, and the people don't want to be a party to it. Unlike the toppling of former President Omar al-Bashir more than 2 years ago, the power newly snatched by the military has been greeted with fierce criticism by locals. Now, there's outrage in Sudan, and the rest of the world is reacting. Friends are severing ties, and associates are pulling back. The people have rejected a takeover by the military. For them, it's once beaten, twice shy. Now, the rejection, unfortunately, isn't coming without casualties, as some citizens have paid the ultimate price, the price of freedom or the price for bravery. Death is a long path to peace. Mali, Guinea, and now Sudan in 1 year. What does coup really mean in Africa? What does it mean to Africans? Welcome to VSA. I'm Sulaiman. Well, on 11th of April 2019, the Sudanese military removed former President Omar al-Bashir, to the excitement of the Sudanese populace. Now, the toppling of the government, which at that time wasn't wanted by the people, was a way forward for the progress of the nation, or so citizens thought. More than 2 years since then, the reality hasn't changed much. A transitional government headed by Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok was supposedly going to take the country back to where it belongs until the man thought otherwise, who struck. Now, Sudan's revolution is cut short, and General Abdel Fattah Burhan and his lieutenants are taking on the whole country. Now, locals would not agree, not without a fight. Tired of the military, drained by the stagnant state of the nation, they say the army can't be trusted again. With Hamdok, his family members and the members of the Sovereign National Council placed under arrest and has just been released, well, the people are standing up to reject their new reality. Almost 10 people have been killed in protest and more than 40 are injured for standing up against the army. A peaceful revolution hasn't gone without blood, and the tension is palpable. Joining me to look at this today, pretty much later, and someone will be joining us from Sudan. My colleague Taban Gabriel, a Sudanese journalist and public affairs analyst, should join us. But for now, I have Byron Adera. Good to see you, Byron. He's an ex-Kenyan Special Forces officer and security consultant, and has been one of our analysts here on the square. Good to see you again, Byron. Quickly, I'm sure you've been following the situation in Sudan, and let us in on what you felt when the news first hit you about the coup in that country.
Thanks for the question, Sulaiman. I mean, Sudan has had a long-standing history of this kind of fiasco. It dates back, decades, with a bit of, a misguided leadership here and there. You can call it strongmanship under Omar al-Bashir, and who, it should be remembered that basically came to power after a coup itself. So it sounds interesting that in Africa it almost looks like you live by coups and you die by coups to some extent, and this has pretty much led to breakdown in several other areas that are critical for the management of the running of nations, and to a huge extent, of course, impoverished the key beneficiaries of leadership at the top level, that is the civilian populace. In Sudan, as you rightfully put it, we've had a bit of a serious involvement of the military, and when you talk about these coups, to a huge extent, it's been propagated by the military involvement in the running of the nations. If you compare that side by side with the nations that enjoy relative peace, you'd find out that the involvement of the military is pretty much put under control, and the constitutions in those kind of spaces or nations that enjoy relative peace have had to make sure that the military element of national power play a passive, if you may, a very neutral role So in Sudan, you see a very strong departure from that perspective. And you can point a strong finger at the fact that the military's involvement, and you could call them the remnants of the Bashir's regime, have had to curtail the efforts that have been put on the shoulders of the transitional government that are looking at, or fairly much we're looking at under the Prime Minister, looking at making sure that Sudan is actually taken back on the rails of sanity, peace, stability, and perhaps economic development in that nation that's been, ravaged by, continued instability and insecurities for decades.
Quite a lot. Looking at first, it would seem as if the day is a good day in Sudan because the Prime Minister has been released. And just before we both came on live, the African Union has suspended Sudan's participation in all activities until the restoration of civilian-led authority, as highlighted. But one key thing here, Byron, let's talk about the people. For the first time in many years, we're getting to see Africans, especially the Sudanese, now standing up against the military, saying, no, wait a minute, this is not what we want. Enough is enough. Did this come to you as any surprise?
Not at all. I mean, Africans are fairly much fed up, by and large, and it is not fairly because of, this kind of coups that are propagated by, runaway military officials that seems to basically put hold. Yeah, so I was saying the Africans fairly much are fed up with authoritarian leadership. If it's pegged on the strongmen that the military guys are, or the military element of national power, then you will expect 9 out of 10 that the leadership, unless it's very well articulated, the leadership thereof will almost always be very authoritarian. And that's not what would impress the civilian, the citizenry for that matter. I mean, the processes that are undertaken to the extent that these coups do also happen are such that you would expect the outcomes thereof to be unjust. I mean, if you look at Sudan and then you look back a little bit to the regime that was under Omar al-Bashir, there's been cases of, the effects on crimes, of humanity and that have been indicted even on the president himself by the ICC. So that's not something that would inspire hope on the part of the civilian populace that know exactly what it's caused to them in the past in terms of genocide, if you may, and loss of lives in tens of thousands in that particular country. So that's not something that would inspire hope and confidence on the part of the military. And as you clearly know from the 21st of September thereof, when the Prime Minister came out strongly and under his civilian side of the pillars, that are on that country, saying that the military were getting themselves a lot more involved in the runnings of the transitional government to a point where they were sponsoring protests, for that matter, that basically put blockades in one way or another in the kind of runnings of that country. So military involvement, and quite fairly so from the civilian perspective, and you see the protests thereof are based, are well-founded on a past that is painful in terms of the experiences under these people. And it must be remembered that the military men, fairly much, and the remnants of that regime had been in that country in control of key economic sectors. And to a huge extent, billions of money, if not dollars, are lost to companies or organizations that are under these kind of men. And you'd not expect fairness or them to be smiling with the kind of change that this transitional government were going to put in place in terms of recovery of the lost, kind of economic elements here and there under the hands of the military, which must be rebuked in the strongest terms possible.
Well, Byron, you use the word hope somehow there, and that's a strong word. Quickly, let's put this, side by side with what you highlighted, talking about the civilians, the civilian population, the citizens in Sudan. Keep in mind, it was only 2 years ago when the military removed Omar al-Bashir. These same people rejoiced and they welcomed the takeover of President then Omar al-Bashir. And 2 years down the line, they're doing something quite contrary. And so now, the hope which you mentioned, is it a dashed hope or a renewed kind of hope in the new administration of Hamdok, to the extent that they felt that another takeover will truncate the expectation or expectations of what was to come from the administration of Hamdok and his team?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you look back to 2 years when the takeover was in Bashir, the kind of enthusiasm with which this change happened and the hope, in the populace thereof was fairly much well-founded on the fact that there could be changes among the individuals that were in the past regime, and if they washed their hands clean, then they would dine with the kings on the new table. But then again, people change, and of course, old and bad habits die hard. So people can come with open arms and say, hey, we've learned from this past, bad ideas and bad habits, but we can pretty much change ourselves into, that's easier said than done. So, and that's the manifestation that you see right now. I mean, there's a special council and the committees that were formed to have a look at, damaging the economic and the political, apparatus that were left behind by Bashir. On the 26th of September, you pretty much know that a special military unit that was actually tasked with protecting that airport and that particular committee withdrew. And that is not to say it's something that you can pretty much take positively. It's not a sign of goodwill from that perspective. So what I'm saying here is, yes, people can say one thing and they do a completely different thing altogether. And that's not something that would inspire hope and stability even among, the civilian populace that are looking at that space and saying, are these guys going to be the people that they can trust with the most critical elements of leading this country? And to the huge extent on the other end, there's a transition of government as a partnership between the civil and the military. So if you have on one hand, people playing dirty tricks under the table, that's not something that you can entrust with the stewardship of a government to, of course, guarantee peace, security, stability, and of course, economic restoration for that particular country, Sudan.
Byron, some of the key things, looking at the people, we'll come back talking about the people, but again, for the continent, just as a lot of others are worried, the African Union is already saying, well, Sudan is being placed, there's a ban placed on Sudan by the Union until situation returns. Tell us how this is working, because once a lot of Africans thought that the AU was already a sleeping union. Is it right to say the AU is awake and ready to move and work?
I'll be optimistic here, but of course I lockstep with the rest of the Africans, and you being one here, pretty much that that indictment is as valid as it can get, because fairly much the AU has been pretty much a toothless dog, and to some extent, dancing on the graves of the bad things that happen in African nations. They've not showed their teeth, figuratively speaking, to a huge extent, especially with regards to the way they've handled problems that are affecting African countries. One, I think, because one of those is that if you look at the coups that have happened elsewhere, the AU have not come out strongly to spell, and I think that there needs to be a ratification of their charter to make it difficult for coups like this to be recognized, one, and two, for them to actually even form functional government. So there should be those very positive steps, and the AU should pronounce themselves quite positively and quite strongly on the same. I mean, to the extent that countries, in terms of democracies, even the world over, when you compare notes with some of the best practices, is that there's a limit to presidential term. But the AU has been here, and we know there are people in this day and age in Africa who've ruled, and to the extent that you're probably thinking they're live presidents. And the AU has actually been there, in this particular continent and watching this from probably some very lazy background. So those are some of the things that would make you and me, and of course other people, to think about the AU and not to have a bit of, fairness with their judgment or indictment on the AU's performance thus far. So those are just some of the examples that we can shake a stick at. But of course, there's more. there's a bit more that the AU can pretty much do. They can't be the people that are actually waiting for things to happen. There's a lot more intelligent approach that the AU can apply in terms of just managing their bias. And it does not just to be taken on the military coups or to this extent. There's, of course, even the civilian coups that have all led to quite some unrests and have set nations back, decades, if you ever look at how some of the African nations have performed. And so the AU can apply themselves to some intelligent approaches and remake their frameworks with the way they're dealing with nations, not just some kind of paying some lip service to the coups that happen or the bad things that really just happen under their noses and that go unaddressed. Of course, to the grave suffering of the populace that are being, led or being put under some of these mad regimes.
Well, Byron, it looks to a lot of people that there is what the continent can now call the Sudanese citizens example, because for the very first time in a long while, people haven't actually seen citizens who come out en masse, troop out to the streets and reject a coup of such. And now the World Bank has also suspended its aid to Sudan after the military staged a coup there. Just as we've also told our viewers that the African Union has also suspended Sudan. And it looks like this may actually be a wrong move for General Burhan and his team, after all.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, bad things happen, as they say, sometimes because the good people do not do or stop those bad people from doing those bad things. So I'm happy with the efforts thus far. Much as the AU is now coming out strongly, I'm also happy with the pressure that's being put on these particular individuals by the international community. General Abdel and of course, his Deputy General Mohammed, have got to realize that military coups that have been hastily put together because you are not satisfied with one another don't have a space and time in this world of today. And of course, that is careless, because to the extent that we had the transitional government in place, and of course there was the agreement with the civilian and the military side of things, the Sovereign Council that it leads must have basically had a look at the big picture, because part of what is now happening in Sudan, and of course it shakes the whole international community. Sudan is not just for the Sudan people alone. There's Kenyans inside Sudan, as you may pretty well know. There's Nigerians in Sudan. Basically, we live in a global kind of village, and the extent that we have a lot of socialization right now, then everybody's affected. So it doesn't surprise me that the international community now realizes that we are in one big, small globe that is everybody's business. Any bad thing that happens elsewhere has an effect on everybody else, where we could be enjoying relative peace and stability. So the whole international community have got to come out very strongly and state their stand on what's happening in Sudan. And we sure hope that the instability that's been experienced in Sudan right now will come to very, quick resolution.
Well, let's see if Gabriel can actually join us now. Gabriel, well, thanks for your patience, and we're excited that you're back again. Quickly here, tell us how the Sudanese people are coping with the latest development going on in Sudan.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you some information about the development in Sudan currently. I'm currently in Juba, in South Sudan, but it's a one country. After the independence, it's divided into two, but we still move like kind of one citizen free border entries and all this. Whatever that is happening in the Sudan currently, based on the proximity of it to Sudan and on the economic perspective, it's really affecting people a lot in South Sudan. And considering the big population of South Sudanese have moved to Khartoum, they own land there, they own a lot of assets in Sudan. Right now, the perception of people is the military takeover is a wrong move.
So I'll come back to you, Gabriel, quickly. Let's return to Byron here. And Byron, some of the key things we're trying to look is how stability can return to Sudan, and how much of a staying power can these military officers, hold out till they return to democracy. So what more do you think the world can do, in terms of rejection? Because the ultimate rejection has to come from the people, which the world has seen already. And now the World Bank is already doing the same, just as the AU. Are there more you expect to see in the coming days that will make this reversed to what it was?
Once all is said and done, the major part of correcting, if you may, what happens with you has to come from within. So rightfully said, the Sudan's people's protests, which are lawful protests by the civilian populace that's come out strongly to reject the military takeover, is one of those ways. And it sure hoped that, General Abdel and, of course, the leadership of the Sovereign Council will realize very quickly that that was a wrong move. And, of course, the Sudan people are thirsting for, rational, democratic leadership of that particular space. Once that is done, and is cemented, then the processes of the transitional, government, as it was envisioned, has got to take place in an open environment of fairness, because fairness has got to be seen even to the people themselves, even after this process has been done. Fairness has got to be seen to be done in terms of even the distribution of appointment and things like that, because those are the points where, impasse or conflict, for that matter, start. The international community have a huge part to play. Sudan is like a small baby right now that needs its hands held. And part of the reconstruction of the losses that we have on the economic front, even on the political front, have got to do with the international community coming out strongly in support of the transitional processes. Part of that is basically in terms of the economic reconstruction, the aids that are coming from the international community. I know the UN the other day, and of course the US did suspend $700 million that's going into Sudan. I so wish that once all is said and done, and the military, strongmen are seen to be out of the way, then this kind of international support, support from the international community has got to come in strongly in support of Sudan's reconstruction. Another thing is that I know for certain, when you benchmark with nations where systems seem to work, part of that is this country, Kenya, where I come from. What we have from their military background is that we are we say we are apolitical. So as an officer, in the special forces or in the army, for that matter, we know that part of us, doing our job is to steer quite away and clear of political involvement, because there's a very good reason as to why, that has got to happen. The military element of national power is just one among the many other elements of national power. The political one, and of course, for democracies that work, it's all put on the shoulders of the civilian, populace. Of course, the strongman at the president, like in our case, comes from the civilian background, and he assumes his rightful position as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That is the point of intersection between the army or the political element of that national power and the military element of national power. If you have military, persons, like you can see in the example of Sudan, being tasked with some key economic sectors, then you'd expect people to have personal interest or varied professional interests, for that matter. And those are the kind of individuals who bring problems. I would not think twice before they make a decision to, organize a coup, because those are things that they got to protect for posterity. As the gentleman from Sudan has clearly said, you understand that some of these military men have quite some huge stake in the economy of Sudan, or rather the mismanagement of the economy, to the extent that they have a lot to their names, and to the, at the behest of the civilian populace that have been going through untold suffering. more than, quite a fair share of the percentage of that population is living under the poverty line. So if you have such kind of elements, being shaken quite a bit, you'd expect this kind of coups to be coming up, because people are expecting themselves to protect this kind of assets or rather interests that they've amassed to themselves over time. And that's key to note right there, because the involvement of the military, to the extent that they take critical stand on the management or the economies of the nation or things like that, is not something that would augur well with the running of nations. And that to me is a trigger point to this kind of coups that we see in Africa. But maybe I should add that African problems fairly much are a problem of leadership, or really bad leadership on the part of the gentlemen and women that rise to those positions. And that's something that's got to be looked at very, very carefully, and to a huge extent, of course, in the hands of the civilian populace that excel as their duty, with the vote, to look keenly at those individuals and interrogate those particular people that they put, the huge responsibility of the stewardship of nation on their shoulders.
Well, Byron, we'll take a moment, we'll come back. For those just joining us, we're looking at development in Sudan, and the world is truly and really worried, just as the world was trying to forge relations with Sudan, knowing full well that the economy in Sudan was already in shambles. The military struck. We'll give you background to how it started in 2019 with this relationship between the civilians and military having an agreement to run the affairs of the country before the civilians were pushed away by the military. That's when we return. Stay with us. Well, it's our home run here on Village Square Africa, and we're looking at developments in Sudan. Recall a whole lot is already happened there. We're hoping that we can get back to Taban Gabriel. But in the meantime, more protesters are joining the call for the restoration of the transitional government, and the whole world hasn't supported the coup as expected. Now, General Buran said infighting amongst politicians, a show of ambition and possibilities of violence led the military to stage a coup. Now, the question is, when does a coup become more important than a democratic process? While many have rejected the coup, it was long coming and had all the fingerprints of a potential tension. There are pertinent questions. What was the world watching? As protesters gathered in front of the presidential palace calling for a military takeover of the government, there were proof of potential eventualities. Now, let's take a look at this. Still have with me Byron Derek. Thanks for your time, Byron. And quickly here, this is for Africa and for Africans, because a lot of people are worried. First, we saw Mali, we saw Guinea, and now it's Sudan. Do you think a section of the international community also had a strong hand in this coup? Because sometimes Africans still think that there is some puppet master outside the continent.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. I do agree to some extent that if you have a look at African nations and you're thinking back to the days when they were under the colonial masters, for that matter, or the international puppeteers, for that matter, then some of the gains of independence can actually be said to be elusive. We are going through, to a huge extent, if you check out some other countries, what you'd call neo-colonialism, and there are quite some grape, and a toehold in the brains of the people that rise to the top, and they are more like wagged by the international community who have interests. There could be, of course, economic interests. And Africa is rich. This is the next frontier. So that is not something to shake off. The table of considerations. If you are looking at the problems affecting Africa, and if you're also looking at getting homegrown solutions for African problems and by Africans themselves. So that is something that we must be totally aware of in terms of how the governance systems in Africa are happening, and of course the participation and or the inactions thereof, or actions by the international community, or as you rightfully called it, the puppet masters. So that is something that I do agree with, and that's why I'm saying, for African problems to be to benefit from long-lasting solutions, then we must be having men and women who can sit on a table, negotiations table, and look at themselves with absolute fairness and honesty and say, hey, we are going wrong. Where do we start to have this conversation to get to the right direction? And that's what I think fairly much needs to happen even to Sudan, much as the international community should also come out very strongly in terms of pushing for mediation, between the warring factions in Sudan, because that's what's gonna, bring lasting solutions to a huge extent. And the AU has got to rein in very, very strongly, because this is their baby. In terms of course, if the military side, led by General, Abdal, the Sovereign Council, did put their foot down on this mad scenario that they are pushing, then sanctions, and very strong sanctions for that matter from the AU, and of course even the international community, should push them to the negotiations table to ensure that Sudan does not glide back to the civil strife that we've witnessed in for the past decades, or maybe to resuscitate the bad regime that was propagated by Omar al-Bashir, because we sure know that there are remnants of that past abusive regime in the current dispensation.
No, Byron, let's step back a bit now and say you're putting on your security expert hat on and look keenly into Sudan. Did you see what the general and his team is saying to the world, that there was going to be civil war if they hadn't done this? Did you see any of such coming into Sudan until now?
Not at all. I mean, the general is living in a dreamy world and is misguided. I mean, he's reading off a very rotten reality landscape of reality, because we know it as much as you can clearly see what's happening in Sudan today. The civilian populace are pretty much rejected that military takeover close to the last man. And so that leaves us with only one assumption here, that even the sponsored protests that went to the government offices, because on the 21st, of September, the Sovereign Council did come out strongly and indicted the civilian, management of the country's affairs, led by the Prime Minister, and said, because of them propagating their own personal interests, then there could be some kind of coup. But of course, there was a rejoinder by the government side of the Prime Minister-led faction that did say that probably the military, element right there, led by the General Abdal, was possibly having a direct threat to the infrastructure that was put in place to ensure that there was that smooth transition. So I choose to go with the other side. Because if you look at the protests that were propagated, then you may as well say that these were pretty much pushed by the military faction to basically give that idea or that sense of dissatisfaction for the civilian populace. But of course, in terms of numbers, if you considered the protests that were being sponsored by, rather, as I believe, by the military side, led by the Sovereign Council, if you compare that to the number of guys that are now coming out of the street to protest against the military takeover, then you sure can pretty much shake a stick at the fact that the military side, led by General Abdal, are probably misguided to a huge extent on their claims. So I choose to look at that, take that with a pinch of salt. knowing that a coup is not probably the best answer. Even if there was that level of dissatisfaction, then they had the power to go to the negotiations table and project a peaceful resolution and of course, restoration of anything that they had that is caught with, rather than, take the country to the brink of civil strife with unimaginable, destruction of property, as you can pretty much see if the protests were to go, beyond limits, and of course, loss of lives and livelihoods in a country that we've had to think of, when you mention total destruction and, of course, this instability, peace and security.
So, Byron, again, General Burhan has said that he will conduct election in 2023, even though some already think that's a pretty longer time. Isn't this indicative of his knowledge that the era of military coups are over, for him to say he wants election to come in 2023?
Yeah, probably. If you look at that from the prism of good judgment, then it's a step back to some extent. The general in this case is trying to give the sense that he is good-willed, if you may, to a point that he sees Sudan going through some kind of elections in 2023. But of course, that's so far off that if you're thinking a life under a totalitarian leadership, as the civilian populace in that particular space are pretty much envisioning, then it doesn't spell any kind of hope, that would even happen, even if it came in 2050. So it should come sooner, from my perspective, it should come sooner than that. But of course, the general here is trying to give a perception that, of course, they are goodwill, and to some huge extent, they're also hoping to hand over power, which we see all indications are such that they are not playing, an active role. And of course, it's been said that they're not participating very honestly in the civilian, of course, military agreements that have been in place since the ouster of Omar al-Bashir in Sudan. So that does not inspire goodwill, even to people who are watching this, and subjecting this to close scrutiny. It is something that's said to psychologically sit in the brains of the populace in Sudan, and to see them from some good light that, of course, they are goodwill and they're very well intentioned. But in a practical sense, that is not something that I'm ready to put my finger on. I don't think that the general is guided by good judgment, and they don't have good intentions. What they fear, what they have in themselves is the fear of adverse kind of happenings to themselves, and that's probably the strongest point from which they made the decision to launch this coup.
Let me quickly bring you here again. You said something about the continent. For a bit, let's start talking about the continent and see what we can learn from your country, Kenya. It was only recently you celebrated Mashujaa Day, which was formerly known as Kenyatta Day. And quite frankly, sitting back here in Lagos, Nigeria, watching, I was excited because I could see true love, true spirit of reconciliation, and for people coming together. How can that be, taken into every aspect of the continent, to the extent that irrespective of your tribe or your culture or religion, where you're from, you have a day where we can all sit down and say, hey, come on, we're brothers, we're sisters. The Mashujaa example.
Yes, Sulaiman, I'm happy that some of the public holidays are celebrated in this country. And Mashujaa Day is a day that celebrates, our key critical leaders, heroes in this country that did pay, some of them, the ultimate price for the nation to be what it is today. And it's quite some very interesting history. And as they say, that if you pushed yourself further back, and of course now that's coming to a point where you are married, locking step with history, then you can pretty much push further forward. And that's exactly what the country is being told. Kenya has also had its dark days, post-election violence, civil strife, here and there. That's not to say that that in itself is something that can set a country totally on the wrong path. And what you have seen happening in this country when those things did happen is that the key leadership, the leaders that had influence, came together and reasoned, and that's the start point for that matter. And it was in an environment of honesty, and where people come, bearing things quite clearly before each other and say, hey, I went wrong in this part, on this part, and of course I think you did other. And so how do we move on from this perspective? So that is something that can actually happen, everywhere. And the problems that we have in Africa is that the demarcations, even for that matter, during the colonial period, the artificial ones for that matter that are put to us by the colonial masters don't actually exist. We could have districts or provinces or counties, and we could have organizations in terms of demographics that also spell strongly tribes. But that does not mean that we are different in any way or form. We should celebrate. And of course, I know a lot of stuff that happened in Nigeria, a lot of stuff that happened elsewhere, across the globe. And it should interest me that I could go somewhere and learn something that I didn't know. And so those are points of departure that are actually interesting for togetherness and for our enjoyment of our national heritage, or even global heritage, if you wish. So as a people, we should look critically at what affects us and try to dig deeper and look at the opportunities and, of course, the enjoyments that exist therein, rather than propagate those particular, points of departure for weakness. And the weakness here, I mean, fighting over things that are immaterial and sometimes nonsensical. So, and that brings us to a point where we're thinking the leadership is absolutely critical, because the critical mass, which is the national will, which is the people, form themselves and gel themselves around ideologies. And those ideologies in the political landscape present themselves in terms of, different political factions. So much as political competition can happen in an environment that can be very emotive to some extent, when elections are called, and this is a question of infrastructure, and we have fairness in the dispensation of that critical function, then people can come out of it agreeing that, yeah, we lost, but we basically are still partaking of the national cake, because you have a leadership that is there to, inspire, and gel people together and inspire togetherness. And of course, we'll address itself to the equitable distribution of the resources there in those countries, of that particular country, for the benefit of all. So those are things that are very critical, and that's why I talk about leadership, because African problems fairly much stem from that perspective, where we have leaders who actually think that they came from God, or people still want to say that, leadership, which of course is factual. But we have people who are sliding under the shadows of religiosity, if you bring, of course, the aspect of God in the equation, but of course, propagating criminalities. So if you are there and you are a leader, even in your own home, we hand over to the next generation. You cannot say that I'm going to be a father in this house for eternity. Trust me, you will die. So if you don't bring up a family that's going to go to the next level with good, practices or good character, then in a sense, you're building a family that's going to be destructive to itself and to others. And that's how it happens in this political space as well, or in the running of a nation. If you have presidents who still demagoguery and still thinking that they came from God, and so they're able to rule for the longest and stay there to rule over the citizenship with iron fist, like what you saw with al-Bashir, who, unto him, history remembers him so sadly and so badly. And we have other presidents out there that are still imagining that can happen. Then, the electorate are partly to blame, because we put these people in those positions of power. So the exercise of the voting system, the infrastructure development in terms of critical bodies that fairness within governance infrastructure is absolutely critical for the management of the business of countries, for that matter.
Well, I think that said, I'm hoping that quite a number of Africans can get something from that, because you never can say enough of the good inherent in that fantastic day in your country. Nigerians watched with envy and admiration, saying that irrespective of political divide, that day sort of heal wounds. And if the military in Sudan is saying, well, we had some foreknowledge of a civil unrest coming, and that is why we came on, at least they can actually get the manual of Mashuja Day and see how that can work. Quickly here, help us. How can future coups, be averted on the continent, considering Mali and Guinea just recently?
If you look at the funny stories. I'll call them funny, behind the coups that did happen in Mali, especially Guinea. You know, a dissatisfaction with the special forces branch of the military, for that matter. And we know of Colonel Mamadi, who was in the French Legion, was picked by the president himself, Alpha Conde, and brought, and he was a right-hand man. You know, nothing gets further from having the closest friend or closest person being the guy that stabs you in the back, for that particular example. But it sure goes so far to say that militaries that are formed and gelled around in discipline or not professionally articulated in terms of their doctrine, training, and the way they do their business, have a way to probably lose track of their very key function of, protecting their countries from external aggression. And that's the key to what the military should actually be doing. I know for certain that that's the critical and primary role of militaries, the world over and in each and every country that you can profile. The military's business is to protect countries from external aggression, and to a limited extent, they can come in to participate in civilian kind of restoration of peace and stability, if you may, because we have some, the new dynamics in terms of threats that may need the armies to come in, but not to the extent that they wade into the political affairs of the countries thereof. So that is one departure that I see in mostly, and with all fairness, the Francophone nations, if you consider their histories and their past, and the way their armies are actually organized and professionally, put in place to do their business, then you find a place of weakness that in some cases may inspire, and bring out those vulnerabilities, if you may, from the security perspective, of their involvement in the political coups that you've seen in, the examples you've given of Mali and Guinea. And so, to the extent that this could be averted, that's the key thing. One of them is to professionalize the armies thereof and to spell out their roles very, very clearly, and to also get them out of the table in terms of political runnings of the country, so that they do not get in very, very close. As I said, and I gave the example of our nation, country Kenya. I know because I served within the army, and it's actually a crime to a huge extent to actually be political, to openly, push a political interest and say, hey, I'm on this side, I'm the other. So we are apolitical, and that's a start point. The other bit in terms of averting, this kind of coups, if we were well behaved, for real, if they say, as they say, if you have something that works and it doesn't seem to be going astray, then there's no need to fix it. So part of why these coups are actually happening, if you profile these countries, is because we have bad people managing, really bad systems within these kind of places. And of course, the product of the same, or the outcomes are really bad, that people are fed up with the same. And look at Guinea, a country of 13 million individuals, and it's one of the poorest nations on earth. You look at the president when he's being fished from his, palace, and you see a man, living in absolute opulence. Who unto him, if you are living like that, and you have the population that you purport to lead as a president, and you are put in place to actually look at the interests of the people that you're leading, living on nothing, below the poverty line fairly much. So, and the Guinea right there is a country that can be said to have absolute richness in terms of endowments, mineral resources and things like that. And so the bad governance on the part of the people, these affected countries, is one thing that may inspire someone to have a look at this space and say, why not dislodge this person if we get a gap and the space and the time and capacity to do the same? So that's another. The other bit, if you look at the way the power plays in terms of geopolitics, you're looking at the involvement of the puppeteers, and which we've discussed here. That's another thing, and which we have to be very wary of, and which we have to be in charge of. The people that are charged with the runnings of the government are going to be awake to the fact that there could be an extent to which there's a bit of manipulation here and there for other interests other than what should serve African countries. And then, of course, the AU's role, and we've talked about it quite critically. If the AU has been, pussyfooting around their involvement, and of course even their key roles, in the way they articulate their key roles, lockstep with what happens in the, in the continent today, then they may do with a few ratifications here and there of their special charters to, in one way or another, put stopgaps. One way of looking at this is like if you're looking at these, military juntas, there shouldn't be, a space and time for them in this day and age. And those governments that are formed by coups should be, strongly rebuked, and to a huge extent should actually be lacking in, recognition. And that's the AU's job. There's a lot, the AU's job, and that should be a job that has got to be relooked by the AU, and they should interpret their roles in this particular plan very critically for the wellness of the African countries that they lead.
Well, Byron, I must thank you very much for your time, for making clear situations in Sudan at the moment. We're hoping that we'll stay on this. And again, we should also be having some other conversations regarding security situation on the continent here. I'd like to thank you again, Byron Adera, who is an ex-Kenya Special Forces officer and a security consultant and one of our security analysts here on News Central Television. Pretty bad we couldn't continue our conversation with Taban Gabriel, who is my colleague, Sudanese journalist and public affairs analyst, owing to a bad communication connection to him. We're hoping that, in 1 year, Africa has experienced 3 coups d'etat, and some have been botched. A continent that struggles like ours has the potential, as highlighted by Byron, for many eventualities: war, violence, and coup. But like every battle is faced headlong, the will of the people must also prevail. Many thanks to the people of Sudan for fighting this head on, and we wish them the very best. I'm Sulaiman. See you again.